For nearly 3 centuries, from the very first colonial settlements all the way to the dawn of the 20th century, a whole series of conflicts raged across North America. Now, this wasn't just one single war. It was a long, brutal, and incredibly complex series of struggles that really fundamentally shaped the United States. So together, we're going to break down this difficult but absolutely crucial part of American history.
Take a look at this number, 250,000. By 1890, that was the estimated population of Native Americans left within the contiguous United States. And to put that in perspective, just 90 years earlier, in 1800, that number was around 600,000. That's a staggering decline, and it really sits at the very heart of this story.
So, the big question is, how did this happen? What were the forces, the policies, and the key moments that defined this entire 300-year period? Well, that's what we're here to understand.
To really get this, we have to start before the United States was even a country. Because the early years were not some simple story of natives versus newcomers. No way. It was far more complicated, a really messy, multi-sided conflict with players from all over the globe.
You know, this really challenges the simple narrative that we often hear. You have to remember, Native American tribes were not just one single group. They were all distinct nations with their own goals, their own strategies, driven by everything from who they traded with to old rivalries with other tribes. And they frequently allied with European powers against other tribes, or even against other European colonies.
And you had all the major colonial empires of the time in the mix. The British, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. They were all competing for land, for resources, and for influence in North America. And of course, they brought their old world rivalries right along with them, basically turning the continent into one massive theater of war.
And on the other side, well, there were hundreds of diverse and powerful Native American nations. What you see here is just a small sample of the major groups involved, just in the areas east of the Mississippi. From the powerful Iroquois Confederacy up in the northeast, down to the Cherokee and Creek in the southeast, every single group had to figure out how to navigate this totally new world.
And these complex alliances were absolutely crucial. I mean, during huge conflicts like the French and Indian War, Native American nations made smart, strategic choices, often siding with whoever their main trading partners were. So we had the French allying with groups like the Algonquians, while the British found allies in the Iroquois Confederacy. It was a world of constantly shifting allegiances, not a simple two-sided fight.
But then, 1776. The American Revolution changes everything. I mean, everything. The old colonial power dynamics were just shattered, and a brand new, single-minded force for expansion emerges on the continent.
All of a sudden, the whole situation simplifies, but in a really dangerous way. Instead of being able to play multiple European powers against each other, Native American nations were now facing just one primary entity, the United States, a nation that was literally built on the idea of westward expansion. The game had completely changed.
Then came 1830, and that drive to expand, it was officially written into law. The Indian Removal Act gave the U.S. government the legal power to negotiate and ultimately force tribes to move from their ancestral homelands in the east to new territory out west. And let's be clear, this wasn't a suggestion. This was official state policy.
And the human cost of that policy was just devastating. The most infamous example, of course, is the forced removal of the Cherokee Nation, which we now know as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died on that brutal march to what is now Oklahoma. And this wasn't just the Cherokee. This same policy was used against the Creek, the Seminole, and many other nations all across the American Southeast.
Okay, so this brings us to the final phase of the wars. This took place mostly out on the Great Plains and in the American West, and this is where the conflict became even more intense as the United States pushed to settle the continent from coast to coast.
So what was driving this final violent push? Well, it was a bunch of things all at once. You've got the Homestead Act, which opened up millions of acres to settlers. Then there were the gold rushes in places like California and the Black Hills, bringing in waves of miners. The new railways were cutting right through the heart of tribal lands. And on top of it all, the government was doubling down on its policy of forcing any remaining free nations onto reservations. It was a perfect storm for conflict.
This whole era is defined by some of the most famous and tragic events in all of American history. You have the Dakota War in Minnesota, the legendary victory for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho at the Little Bighorn, and then the final brutal massacre at Wounded Knee. These conflicts really were the last large-scale armed resistance to U.S. expansion.
And the human cost here was just immense. Now, these numbers are based on the work of historian Gregory Michnow,
They're estimates and probably incomplete, but they still paint a really stark picture. Just for this period from 1850 to 1890, in the West, Native American casualties from direct conflict were more than double those of the U.S. military and settlers combined.
So, by the time we get to 1890, the major armed conflicts are pretty much over. But the consequences of these centuries of war, well, they would echo through generations, and really, they continue to shape the country today.
And that brings us right back where we started, to that devastating population decline. When you combine the warfare, the forced relocation, and the diseases, it was a catastrophic collapse. That drop from 600,000 to just 250,000 in only 90 years, it tells a huge part of the story.
You know, the end of the wars really just marked the beginning of a new, incredibly difficult chapter. With their lands vastly reduced, their traditional ways of life totally disrupted, the surviving Native American populations were now largely confined to reservations under the full control of the U.S. federal government.
So when all is said and done, how do we define what happened? Well, as our source material notes, some scholars look at all of this and they characterize these events as a genocide. Other scholars dispute that term. It's a really complex and painful debate that continues to this day, and it forces us all to ask, what is the true legacy of a 300-year war?